Thank you, and really wonderful to be back. That was a fantastic discussion yesterday. So I'm going to give a little brief overview, especially focusing on the prevention of cognitive decline. And I think everybody here knows why that's so important, so I'm not going to go into that. We all have cognitive decline in our future if we manage to survive everything else. So we'd like to reduce that and keep us mentally alert as long as we possibly can. Next slide, please. Okay, I've got it. Okay. Great, thank you. So this is very briefly my view of this area, and I know it's much more complex than this, but basically there are two major pathways to the common forms of cognitive decline and dementia. One is vascular disease, and we know a lot, as we heard yesterday, about the prevention of vascular disease. That operates through dyslipidemia, hypertension, inflammation, diabetes, and diet has huge impacts on all of those pathways. But then we have this other pathway that leads to Alzheimer's disease, which we actually still don't totally understand because it had been thought till fairly recently this was just amyloid deposition. But it's clearly more important. The drugs that have targeted that have all failed, and tau protein is involved as well, but still an area for debate. And that's where we have less understanding. But the important point here is that we don't have drugs that treat dementia, despite huge amounts of investment in this area. But that doesn't mean that we can't today do a lot about the prevention of cognitive decline. And that's what I'm primarily here. Very briefly, there have been quite a few studies that have been done on the Mediterranean diet and cognitive function. This is a meta-analysis. Again, we can't see the individual studies, but as you can see, they almost all lie to the left of the vertical line there, and the summary statistic is quite statistically significant there, where the Mediterranean diet pattern overall related to less chance of cognitive decline. Up at the top, there are relatively few studies that have looked at dementia per se, and they're relatively small. Overall, the evidence for that is not very clear. More work is obviously necessary. On the bottom section there is Mediterranean diet and Alzheimer's disease. And there, the evidence is quite consistent and overall a significant inverse association for prospective studies on diet and Mediterranean diet and cognitive decline. I'm going to describe a little bit of the data that our group has been doing, looking at this a little bit differently, taking advantage of the large cohort studies that we have. And here, the conceptual idea underlying this is that cognitive decline is something that starts off probably somewhere in our 20s or 30s as a slow cumulative process, whether it's due to accumulation of atherosclerosis, which starts even earlier than that, or due to accumulation of amyloid or tau protein. So this is clearly a long-term accumulative process. And so in our cohorts, the participants are all health professionals. We know they had to take lots of cognitive tests, not called that, but you had to pass your medical board, your entrance to medical school, then the board examinations, whole series. So we know that these people in our studies had good cognitive function at the beginning of the study. But then we're seeing them then later in life. But we enrolled them from 40 to 75 years of age, and we've been collecting repeated dietary measurements since they were enrolled here, the health professionals, in 1986. So the green areas there the green arrows are dietary assessments, of course, along with all the other data that we collect. And then in 2008 and 2012, we used a simple but high validity assessment of cognitive decline. I'll talk about the specific questions we asked there. And so what we can do is we can look at diet measured repeatedly over a period 20 to 30 years even before the assessment of cognitive decline. These are the cohorts. I think many of you are familiar with them. The Nurses' Health Study, which is 121,000 women. Then Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, 52,000 men. And Nurses' Health Study 2, which I won't show in the data today, another 116,000 nurses. And the basic idea is that we assess diet and other variables repeatedly over time so we can have a good measure of long-term exposure. And we can also look at changes in diet over that time in relation to health outcomes later in life. So this is the simple set of questions that have been developed by Deborah Blacker at our School of Public Health called Subjective Cognitive Decline. And we use these simple questions as a score. And they ask about changes. Do you have more trouble than usual remembering recent events? Do you have more trouble than usual remembering a short list of items, such as a shopping list? And more trouble remembering things from one second to the next, difficulty in understanding or following instructions, etc. The worst is, do you have trouble finding your way around familiar streets? And if you have 3 or more positive items, that's very strongly associated with ApoE4 genotype, which I think is probably the best indicator of the validity of these questions. These are measuring something biological, where people know that something is going on, that their brain is not working as well as it did before. So we've used 3 or more positive responses to define poor subjective decline status. And this is what we've seen. This is the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, 27,000 men followed for, again, for about 30 years with repeated measurements and a clear inverse relationship with your vegetable consumption. And we saw a similar inverse association with Mediterranean diet. And it is interesting. The real advantage we have here is we have such big numbers. We can look at the overall Mediterranean diet, which is strongly inversely related to less cognitive decline. And then we can dig down into the foods and nutrients and try to understand what it is about the Mediterranean diet that seems to be most powerful. And it is, the components we see as most important are fruit and vegetable consumption. So then the question is, what fruits, what's vegetables, what are the components? And we've been able to look more deeply into that. And one set of analyses that's now published, looking at carotenoids. Carotenoids are of particular interest, obviously, almost all from fruits and vegetables. And we see that different carotenoids are inversely related. That's total carotenoids on the left, and alpha-carotene, beta-carotene, lutein, beta-cryptoxanthin, and lycopene, all related inversely to lower chances of having cognitive decline. And these are highly, highly significant. And this is our cohort of men. We've reproduced this in our study of women as well, almost 50,000 women. So very robust data. And interestingly, if you do analyze the brain, there are carotenoids in the brain. So they are getting through the blood-brain barrier and getting to where they need to be to provide antioxidant protection. Then we have looked at this, Fran Grodstein led this analysis in the Physician's Health Study. And this is something this is a study that's very important, I think. I hardly see it mentioned in the world of cognitive function, but this is 4,000 men who were randomized to beta-carotene supplement or placebo, and then followed while they were on this active treatment for 18 years. And that's really unprecedented, I think, in randomized trials to keep people on pill or placebo with good adherence for 18 years. And at the end, their cognitive function was assessed by a telephone interview survey, which is widely used and validated. And there were statistically significant benefits of beta-carotene supplements measured by global score, by the verbal memory, telephone interview score. So I think this, with the observational data based on tens of thousands of people, provide really definitive evidence that beta-carotene does reduce cognitive decline. And that's pretty major, given that this is a disease that has no treatment, and here's something that is beneficial. Now, I don't think that I'm not advocating that everybody take beta-carotene supplements, because I think you can get plenty of beta-carotene for your diet if you pay attention. But one interesting aspect, this is the physicians who, their blood levels of beta-carotene were high at the beginning. This is probably the best nourished group in the world that's ever been studied. And still adding beta-carotene did reduce their cognitive decline to equivalent here in terms of the degree of benefit, delaying dementia by about 1.5 years. Not huge, but certainly if you had another year and a half of cognitive function, that anybody would like to buy into that. So we've heard a lot about polyphenols. Flavonoids are a major class of polyphenols, lots of different kinds of them. We've already heard about the many beneficial biological activities that flavonoids have. And so I won't go into those, but we've recently published data based on the same dietary questionnaires looking at flavonoids. And of course, there's lots of different flavonoids, but we see a number of them strongly inversely related to risk of cognitive decline, even when we control for beta-carotene and intake of other carotenoids as well. So not too surprisingly, probably there are multiple aspects of Mediterranean diet, or lots of fruits and vegetables. And it does look like flavonoids may be part of the pathway. We've then gone on to look at specific foods, because that's what we're all interested in terms of deciding or recommending. And we see, you can't see the names there, but this is men on the left, women on the right, and where have I got? I can't read it even from here, but one or the other. It's remarkable how consistent the findings are from men and women. There's minor differences, but basically all very similar pattern, with some foods having not much relationship with cognitive decline, but others strongly related to less cognitive decline. And then when we use stepwise regression to look at which foods independently have the most robust inverse relationship, it's basically strawberries, blueberries, peaches, orange juice, apples, and grapefruit juice came out at the top of our list. And this is for 3 servings per day. So we're treating similar amounts or similar numbers of servings from each of these different foods, analyzed as continuous variables. So again, it's a picture of, there's no magic bullet here, but probably important contributions from multiple foods and food groups. And then, of course, we do have the very important randomized data from the PREDIMED study. We've already seen this, that Miguel showed us yesterday, showing that with olive oil in particular, in the PREDIMED study, there was less cognitive decline compared to the control group. Where do we go from here? This is a study from Greece that I think is very nice in design, where they looked at high polyphenol olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, sort of moderate polyphenol extra virgin olive oil, and then everybody got a Mediterranean diet, with one other group getting Mediterranean diet with no olive oil. Now, that's maybe a little bit hard to understand what that is, but that was more or less a control group. And the green lines there, the lower the better here by the score that they used. It was interesting that both of the extra virgin olive oil groups had pretty similar benefits for cognitive function. But that study was only 50 people for a year. I would really like to see that study multiplied by 10 for 3 years, but it's a kind of study that we would like to see. There's another trial that's ongoing, the MIND study, which is it's been finished, actually. The data are being analyzed by Frank Sachs in our department. So to conclude, the evidence is strong that a Mediterranean diet can reduce cognitive decline and dementia. Fruits and vegetables account for at least part of the benefit of the Mediterranean diet, and at least part of this is mediated by carotenoids. It's nice to have something firm we can say. I think we can be very confident in that. The role of olive oil per se in reducing cognitive decline, I think, is not totally clear at this time, and would be dependent on what we're comparing it to. We talked about that, a fundamental issue. The role of minor constituents in olive oil in reducing cognitive decline is still, I think, somewhat unclear. And that does whether or not there is a role, it does have practical implications, as we talked about yesterday. Further randomized trials are needed to determine the role of minor constituents in olive oil for reducing cognitive decline. But the point was made yesterday, also while awaiting further data, we can enjoy and recommend a Mediterranean-type diet and expect that this will support cognitive health. And that will be among the benefits of the Mediterranean diet, even while we're still doing more research to understand what components and what their mechanisms are. We can enjoy and recommend the Mediterranean diet today.
Thank you, Walter.